have spent some time getting ready for this presentation. I've written about this concept for, a few months, and I have yet to figure out a way to discuss it without catching myself and thinking, what the hell are you talking about? Why are you talking about this? Everyone already probably knows these things. And I was hoping a few more people would hop in here, but maybe they'll come in later. The topic I want to talk with you about today is the concept of progressive overload. And when I started powerlifting, progressive overload was maybe it was like every single influencer was like, if you want to make progress, then you have to make sure that you progressively overload your muscles. You need to make sure that if you can't add sets or you can't add weight, then you got to add reps. And if you can't add reps, then you got to shorten your time under tension. If you can't shorten time under tension, then you've got to hit a new muscle group and do a different exercise and then try to progress in that fashion. And I think that's well-meaning, and I do think that that's a very useful way to think about, training. However, the question about, or the intent of progressive overload, if you don't know what it is, it's the idea that you progressively add stress to the tissue over time to elicit more and more hypertrophy or strength adaptations. And I think if you don't think about it for too much or for too long, then this is a perfectly acceptable way of kind of visualizing your training. Because at the end of the day, if you are training and your training stress is somewhat effective, if you are unable to add absolute load to the bar, then it's likely you will be able to add, a repetition or two with the same load. But it isn't necessarily guaranteed. And it might lead to frustration for athletes who are kind of experiencing like what I like to call is like a lull in their adaptations. And a lot of people think of this as like a plateau. And I don't really think about training like I'm either progressing or I'm not. It's more like, what is the adaptation that what is the stress that I need to create the adaptations that I'm looking for? And to think about training just in terms of progressive overload, in my opinion, would be too simple, because we train so that we can get stronger. But progressive overload, or the idea of progressive overload, is that we need to be stronger to get stronger. We need to be able to produce more force or exert more force in some capacity to elicit further adaptations. And to me, it's kind of like you're putting the cart before the horse, or a chicken or the egg analogy, where you are wondering what is coming first, the adaptation to your training stress, or the increased training stress to force the adaptation. So if we think about this from like an evolutionary perspective, and I'm probably using that word a little bit too lightly. When we were born, we had a certain amount of stress on our tissues. Gravity basically was and is the primary stress on all of our tissues. And as we fuel our body, we consume food, and our body uses that food to create new tissues. You start to form new bone structures, less bone structures in the case of a baby, because you end up forming different bones and etc. And then those bones start to grow, and then the muscles surrounding those bones start to grow, and you haven't even trained yet, and you're 5 years old now, but you have more muscle mass than you probably did when you were a baby. And part of this is going to be a response to your individual, how your genetics respond to the environment, or how do your genetics respond to the stressors that are put on you at an early age. Not every baby is even required to move very, very often. I mean, I doubt many babies are moving much at all. So maybe by the time someone can walk, the stress of walking that that gravity requires you to overcome. Like, you have to create enough force to be able to walk to overcome the gravitational pull to the earth. And for a long time, that will create a sufficient environment to allow the body to adapt in some capacity. Food is primarily going to continue the growth, the growth stages. And I don't think gravity is the reason that we get taller or anything, but gravity is the primary resistance that we overcome, well, all the time. But if we have no absolute or external load, then that is the stimulus that we have to increase, I guess. So on one hand, progressive overload still applies here, because as a child and as you move through life, it's likely you start to move more and more. You use your body more and more, and tissues typically will adapt to the stimuli that you put it under. So if you are now you're 12 years old and you start playing sports, you either play a sport with a high amount of resistance training, like sprint intervals, for example, which are much more similar to weight training, and perhaps your body is primed to adapt to that stimulus, and you start to develop muscle mass at a greater rate than your peers. Or, for example, you choose a sport, or that sport chooses you, as some people like to say, something like cross country, where a lot of your training is high endurance, sustained endurance training, which isn't typically great for creating a hypertrophic response, but you are still making adaptations for the sport of cross country. Your lung capacity improves, your VO2 max improves, and that's part of why you engage in high intensity or just high duration activity, to put your body under a new stress that we hope it can adapt from. And that's the big thing, is many athletes, or I guess a lot of people who weren't successful athletes, will tell you that there is a limit to how much training stress is effective for them. I'll use myself as an example. I was never good at any sport. I mean, I was, but I wasn't great at adapting to the stress requirements that my coaches put under me, specifically in track and field. That was the one sport where I would get injured consistently, or at least I'd experience pain consistently. I'd strain my hip flexors a lot. It would be difficult to create, a full, powerful stride, and it impacted me in competition. I never really did very well. And knowing what I know now, it's because the stress from, track and field was too great for my body to adapt to. The idea was, well, every few weeks we're going to increase the stress and hopefully you can recover. But I wasn't consuming enough food. I wasn't sleeping well enough. I was stressed about other things in life. And so that stimulus was too great for me. So the progression, I guess, was a bit too aggressive in the sport of track and field. Where I did typically thrive was in basketball, because with basketball, there's a lot more combinations of high intensity and more endurance. So you had more time to rest, whereas sprinting is just all out. No matter what you're doing, you're either doing a 400 meter sprint or a 100 meter sprint. And that training stimulus is great. But for basketball, you do 50 meter sprints max, and then you're kind of jogging, which was a lot more sufficient for my body. Anyway, I would get injured a lot. And there were a few sports that I basically enjoyed because I was able to control the environment a bit more to provide for, or to allow for, more adaptations. Once I realized I didn't like track and field, I ended up doing a lot of strength training in the weight room because I could control that. I didn't have to follow the plan that the coach, set out for me. I could effectively develop my skills at a pace that made sense for me, and at a pace that made sense for my recovery capacity and the nutrients that I was consuming. I was also very young, and I thought that the way to get jacked was to eat just protein and get your fat content and your carbs low, because you got to get shredded. That's how you build muscle. You lose weight to build muscle, and arguably that wasn't very effective. I was like 120 pounds at 5'7", and I was very shredded, but I didn't make a lot of, strength gains or even, I couldn't really tell if I made hypertrophy, gains in muscle mass. However, I was following this like idea of like progressive overload. Lack of overall progress in the sport kind of shifted my preference to start bulking and eating more food. And once I started to eat more food, I was able to then recover from the baseline training stress that I put on my body. But I never really increased the training stress, at least not intentionally. I would never increase the total sets or the total reps. I would simply go into the gym and I would try to hit something near max effort. And then that either created a positive adaptation or a negative one. So a lot of times what would happen, I was get close like RPE 9. I didn't even know what RPE was, but I'd get pretty close to failure on like a squat or a deadlift. Didn't really understand how to properly use my body. And oftentimes after a few weeks or months, I would create some type of low back injury. And it wasn't effective. I was doing too much, even though technically the stress wasn't changing. I was still pretty much I didn't make that much progress. The overall sets and reps were pretty much the same. The only thing that really changed was whether or not the intensity of the load I selected was closer or further away from failure. Now let's progress further into like my college days. In my college days, I started to learn more about RPE. And the idea of RPE kind of helped me to better understand how to make progress in general, because the idea was less about, okay, you need to add weight, you need to add reps, you need to add intensity to increase, to respond better to training, and more as you adapt to different aspects of your life. Maybe you have a high training stress or a high stress day and you go to the gym and you still want the training to be effective. Well, you're going to use RPE. You're going to train at a certain load that you're going to put a certain weight on the bar for a certain amount of reps for a certain amount of reps away from failure. And that is going to elicit or like increase your perceived exertion. Your proprioceptive abilities are going to increase. And this is like an internal load. So this is how difficult the session feels for me based on my environmental circumstances. No matter what sports I played, no matter what adaptations I had made in the past, this made sense to me because I knew my body was a kind of an ever-changing organism. I knew that I didn't always have the same, psychological, physiological capacities on every session, but I still wanted to train despite that. And so that's where we bring ourselves to think about like internal load. And internal load, I find, is a bit more of a useful thought process to think about, like, what is the stress that's required to create an adaptation? Because then it can drive the overload as a kind of a precursor to the adaptation, or as a like proxy for your adaptation. So if you work up to a triple at RPE 8 on week 1 and you hit 100 kilograms, and then maybe you do 2 back off sets at 75% for 2 sets of 5, the back off work is going to be reflected or an adaptation from the top set load. So 75% of 100 kilograms would be 75%, but typically I use estimated max. It doesn't matter. I just use a percentage of the actual load hit. So then the back off work is scaled as the intensity on the bar increases or decreases. So that's going to then increase the overall stress to the body based on the conditions that the body based on the adaptations that the body has made, based both psychologically, physiologically, sociologically, right? If you've ever been in the gym where there's a bunch of people that you really enjoy talking with, then you know how great it is to lift around them. And sometimes you can hit PRs even if the perceived physiological adaptations aren't there. You've made psychological or sociological like changes that encourage or increase neural drive and then increase the amount of weight that's on the bar. So progressive overload, why do we still care about this? Like, what is the intention and what is the thought behind it? Like, at some point, you have to decide, is the stress that you're putting on your body too little or too much? And let's imagine that the initial training stimulus that the first program that you build for yourself elicits significant strength gains. That's the adaptation that we're aiming for, is strength adaptations. Perhaps we're not as concerned with hypertrophy adaptations, but it's likely if you're gaining strength at a rapid pace, you're probably also gaining some muscle. The first program you run for, let's say, 8 weeks is getting you 50 kilograms on your squat, 20 kilograms on your bench press, another 50 on your deadlift. You haven't changed anything about the program other than the absolute load on the bar in relation to the top set and the back off sets. As your body makes adaptations, your ability to produce force with the same, constraints will increase if you're making positive adaptations. Or your training will create too much stress. The nutrients and the environmental circumstances will not be sufficient for you to make positive adaptations, and the load on the bar you're able to the lift reduces at a certain intensity range, a certain RPE. So then we have to think about, again, what do we do in that situation? And that could be where the idea of progressive overload then kind of reemerges. There's actually another scenario where the stress that you have is not enough. It's less than you've previously adapted to, and it's also insufficient to create adaptations. However, there's not like a set limit of stress that is required for you to keep nudging in order to make progress. Otherwise, like Ray Williams would be squatting like 7 times a week just to, increase his strength by like 5 pounds. That's not really how it works. So there's a limit to the increase or decrease in stress that is effective for progress, because you can notice that, especially as lifters get stronger, oftentimes a reduction in their training stress is required to allow for more adaptations. I've noticed it before. I used to train 4 times a week, squatting 3 times a week, deadlifting twice, and benching 4 times a week, and it allowed for great progress up to a certain point where the stress from each session would increase, primarily from a psychological perspective, but also from a physiological perspective, because the back off work, as I got stronger, the relative tonnage or the relative mechanical tension, which we'll talk about in the next presentation, would increase to a degree where it's just too much. There's too much tension, there's too much stress to allow for continued adaptations, especially because my sleep and my recovery and my food intake was suffering due to the fact that I was in school and I had a full-time job, and I was trying to figure out how to not fail at all of them at the same time. So I reduced my training stress, and I reduced my frequency of squatting, and I reduced my overall tonnage, etc. And that allowed me to then continue to make progress. I also was able to do that after having a lot of pain. So then pain is another consideration that you've got to add to the equation. If you're experiencing a lot of pain all the time, it's pretty likely that the training stress that you're under is too great, and your body is kind of fighting you. It's kind of breaking down in some way. Or you're just like, your body's psychologically like, hey, this isn't what we want to do. I can't tell you why you're feeling pain, but there's so many variables there. So the overall point of this presentation is that progressive overload may be useful in a way that we traditionally think of it, like adding rep sets load to the bar. But your body is only going to make the adaptations that it's able to, no matter the training stress that you put under it. So you might think that the requirement is to add training stress to make positive adaptations, but there might be a time in which it's actually best to reduce your training stress to make positive adaptations, because there are other factors that must be considered when it comes to like adaptation. And we know that there's a limit to progressive overload in general, because the total tonnage required for you to train for 22, or let's just say 30 years and keep making progress would be so great that it would be so time, and if like you would be just lifting weights all day. Like David Ricks, for example, he's probably someone that has been training for a long time. He keeps making progress. He's like 62 years old. And I guarantee you that his training stress is not so much greater now than it was like 10 years ago. If anything, it might even be lower. So progressive overload is like a tool. It's an idea. It's a concept that you can decide, do we need to overload this training? Do we need more training stress or do we need less? There are many scenarios where we need both, less and more in certain areas of your body. And that's another thing to think about is like progressive overload to each muscle tissue, to, you know, your tendons, to your upper back. Like adaptations are happening all the time in different ways. And we can't simply think about progression as more total stress. Otherwise, we will be very limited and very frustrated in the long run when, you know, we keep adding, and it doesn't result in, you know, exponential or even linear progress. Sometimes it just is regressive overload or regressive stress. So I want you to think about your training stress as less about whether or not this is more or less work, but more, is this a stimulus that I need in order to make further progress? And you have to think about all the other variables that contribute to your adaptations and your growth. And it's not just tonnage, for example. I mean, that's kind of the main idea. If you're increasing your total load and you're keeping everything else the same, tonnage increases. If you're keeping the total load, the load on the bar the same, but you increase reps, tonnage increases. If you increase sets and the load stays the same, tonnage increases. Tonnage does not need to increase forever for you to make progress, though it likely will increase over time because you're making progress. That's the point. If you understand this concept, if you have any questions about this concept, please let me know. I hope it's not so convoluted that I just broke your brain, but hopefully I've added to how you understand training. And I will talk to you next 2 weeks from now. We're going to be talking about mechanical tension, which I'd argue is a much more relevant factor when it comes to at least muscle hypertrophy. But in many ways, it's how we can think about a lot of different adaptations, because of what contributes to mechanical tension is likely also going to contribute to strength adaptations. So without further ado, I will see you guys next week.